playlist in psychological statistics, and in this batch of videos, we're going to talk about sampling techniques and data collection. So this is our second module in our class, which is again, we're going to talk about sampling and what are the different techniques when we choose our proper and appropriate sampling, and then how do we then collect our data as one of the one of the parts of the definition of statistics, which is data collection. So let's get it on. First, let us give a definition of what sampling is, as we have defined already what a sample is. So remember that a population, which is denoted by our big N, which is our sampling, or rather our population size, big N, and our sample size, which is our small n. So this is universal to the books in statistics that we have read. So what is sampling? Sampling is simply the procedure in selecting the appropriate subjects or participants of the population to be included in the sample. So again, it's a procedure of selecting the participants from the population to be included in the sample. So since we want to have our sample, so sampling is the way or the process on how to do it. Why do we then how or why do we do sampling, or why do we get a sample instead of pushing through the population? So there are four major reasons why. This is not exhaustive, but let's give it a go. Um, the first reason, of course, it is too costly to test the entire population, not only financially, but it is costly when it comes to the effort of the researcher. It is also costly in the time. So this is the most obvious because, for example, if your um, population is all the all the students, everyone, all the student body of the Philippines, which goes through anxiety attacks. So there are a lot of them in different um, islands and in our archipelago. So that will be too costly to test all of them. Number two, it may be impossible to test the entire population. So I'll give you a general example. So if we are interested in making generalizations of all birds, avians in our province, then our statistical population would be the set of all the avians or the birds which exist now or have ever existed or will be existing in the future. So in this case, it is impossible to test the entire population because of this certain constraints. So therefore, it's better, way better to just test the sample, get a sample of all the avians, and that will be part or that will represent our population. Okay. So in the psychological perspective, it may be impossible, for example, to test, say, for instance, everyone who are suffering in a depressive state, in a clinically depressive state. So you may want to check them up first, everyone who have ever had depressive states and those who will ever have that in the future. So that's why we have in our research our scope and limitation to to um, to finalize our sample. And of course, we cannot just entirely get the population because we don't know the data before. We don't have all the data before, and of course, the data in the future. Testing the entire population as number three may often produce error. For example, say a group of researchers did a study in a city under a developing country, wherein a lot of people living in unregistered places and people constantly coming and going, and seldom some are shy to answer or responding. So, trying to actually do a census in this kind of situation is well, we call it a Herculean effort. It will take a lot of effort to do that, and seldom it will produce error because of the people coming and going, and including those who will opt out of the research, though they're part of the population, but since they don't want to, so may produce an error. And lastly, this may be destructive as well. So, for example, when um, we want to test the cars, if they are um, if you are if you will be protected, so we're going to have this crash test. So if ever we have accidents, car crashes, we want to check their durability, let's say. So if we're going to use the population in that scenario, it will be destructive. There will be no cars left of that certain model if we're going to create, if we're going to use the sensor. So therefore, a sample is go-to if that's the case. Okay, so out of all the many reasons of why we do sampling, these are the four major reasons why. I want to re-emphasize that a sample should be a representative of the population. So it cannot just only be a certain group or a certain subset of the population. It should be a representation of that population. Which is part of my notes here. Take note, it is extremely important to choose a sample that is truly a representative of the population, so that inferences derived from the sample can be generalized back to the population of interest. Remember that when we create, going back to the steps on creating or formulating the problem, when we brainstorm about the problem, the next thing that we have in mind is the population of interest. The population is always our interest every time we do our research. It's not only going to be a part of that sample or a part of the population, but it's always going back to the population. So when we generalize, when we conclude things in our research, we always go back to the population, not on the sample. So therefore, um, the sample itself should be the most appropriate, the best as it could be. It should represent the whole population because we're just doing samples or we're just having the samples because of the reasons given before. But when we generalize, when we conclude things, it is always about the population, even though we don't have all the data of the population. So that's why sampling is a critical, pivotal step in the research process. Note that improper and biased sampling is the primary reason of for often divergent and erroneous inferences. So you might see some researches, though published, but gives us two separate answers, two separate conclusions, two um, polar generalizations, mainly because check the methodology, there will be some errors in the sampling there, in either one of them. It may be erroneous because the sampling procedure, the sampling technique is not the most appropriate given that, or even given the sampling technique, the analysis that is done is not appropriate given that sampling technique. So we're going to talk about sampling technique in a while, right after um, these batch of videos. So that will be it for now. It's going to be a quite short video here. And thank you very much for listening. See you in the next one. Bye.